All right, so we're excited for our first presentation of the day, and we're going to hear from our wonderful, esteemed panel of scholars to talk about their ballot initiative research. As always, we love to thank our providers, and Leslie in particular, who has been a stalwart support of our center, of the Unruh Institute, is just wonderful all around. So with no further ado, and just to remind everyone how this is going to run, even though I think even Leslie knows this because she's done this before, we'll go ahead and have the presentation, then we'll come up for Q&A afterwards. I would say since it's a real kind of small group, maybe what we'll do is just sit around the table for the Q&A. That might be a little bit more user-friendly. We can even grab a cookie if we want. Okay. I hear they're calorie-free. So with all that being said, I'll turn it over to the panel.
Okay. All right, hello and thank you for coming here today and listening to what this group has uncovered in the last couple of months. Now myself, Wesley.
I'm Eitan. James. Milo.
Ambika.
We were all tasked to this overarching thematic topic of the effects ballot initiatives have on the democratic system. So now, why initiatives? It's because of the vote. More specifically, it's because of voter turnout rates. Now Mahatma Gandhi once said, "I understand democracy to be something that gives the weak the same chances as the strong." Gandhi was referring to the vote. And it's crucial to vote because we can elect leaders, and through the election of leaders, we implement laws and policies that directly affect citizens in their daily lives. However, the U.S., amongst all the other advanced democratic regimes in the world, has the lowest voting turnout rates of them all. So this leads me to what the group has been specifically researching, which is the ballot initiative system an effective method of governance? Now, seeing that this issue is a multifaceted one, I saw giving some contextual background information as important before we go into each of the presenters' individual research focuses. All right, first is the California ballot initiative system. And so this system is one that it gives citizens a way to propose laws and constitutional amendments without the support of governors or the legislature. And so in our system, we have actually 5 different steps. The first step, as you can see, as I've written here, is that we have to draft the text. So as I mean the proponents of the initiative have to write the text of the new proposed law, and then the second step is to submit the draft. We have to submit the draft, or at least the proponents have to submit the drafts to the Attorney General's office for an official title and summary. So that office will actually analyze the proposition and then write and craft a title and summary of what the people are actually trying to pass. And then the third step is circulation. So what this means is that the initiative petitions are circulated to collect enough signatures from the registered voters to garner enough support for it, and then leading to the fourth point of verification. So then signatures are then turned over to county election officials for verification. This verification process is essentially either passing or qualifying or rejecting this proposition as a ballot. And lastly, voter approval. So finally, California voters will approve or deny the qualified ballot initiative, and if it is qualified, we will see it on the ballots on election day. So in most recently, I guess it would just be the midterm election. Okay. All right, and now an analyzation of what are some of the good points and some of the bad points about our system. And so some of the advantages: the votes actually count, total transparency, government accountability. And so going in and touching on the first advantage, the vote actually counts. And so what this essentially means is that each vote is important, as the cliche states, because the power lies within each citizen. Citizens, through direct democracy, have the ability to affect their own lives as well as their fellow Americans' lives, by pushing forward initiatives and their grievances or their grievances of towards any other established law. The second advantage is total transparency. So the government must provide accurate as well as complete data to its people in a direct democracy, which allows for an open level of communication between the people as well as the government, which increases or it improves the relationship between the citizen and the government and decreases the tension. And finally, government accountability. Initiative process is one that is essentially the citizen's line of defense, in the sense that because citizens do not have to worry about voicing their opinions and what will happen if they do voice their opinions, it creates another level of accountability for the government because it essentially checks their power and allows the people to take matters into their own hands when they see fit. And so, moving on to the shortcomings. Two of the biggest shortcomings is that the system is inflexible, as well as there's been evidence to suggest voter fatigue. And so the inflexibility is due to Article 2, Section 10C of the California Constitution, which essentially makes it incredibly difficult to amend or repeal a law passed via this system. It is difficult to amend or repeal past propositions because voters or the proponents or essentially the citizens have to put forth another bill or proposition in order to fix an established one, which is very costly and oftentimes is unreliable. And so moving on to the final shortcoming is voter fatigue. So there's evidence to suggest that because of the massive amounts of different initiatives put forth on the ballot, people are oftentimes tired of or do not have the time or energy to invest into trying to figure out what each initiative means. And so therefore it decreases the amount of voter turnout rates that we want on election day. So now briefly touching on what propositions that we have focused on, which is the concluding point of the contextualization of the background information. We focused on Proposition 10 and Prop 6. Prop 10 essentially expands local government authority to enact rent control on residential property, and Prop 6 is the California gas tax repeal, and both propositions will be further delved into in the other speakers' presentations, and to see how these controversial propositions affect voter turnout rates and democracy as a whole. So now moving on to the first area of focus is initiatives and how they tie into U.S. democracy. So of the different types of democracy, direct democracy, we've chosen 3 here, essentially just for the reason that these give the citizens the most power of the different types of direct democracy in the U.S. Direct democracy is defined as a form of direct participation that citizens have in decision making as to how their state government functions. And so the first one, briefly, initiated state statutes essentially means that citizens have the ability or the duty to draft the policy, collect the signatures to support that policy, and vote to enact a new law. The second one, veto referendum, also known as citizen referendum or statute referendum, refers to 2 different situations. The first is that a legislative body like the state legislature, city council, or county commission enacts a new law. Or the second situation that the veto referendum refers to is when an opposing group of a specific law collects enough signatures to ratify or reject a new law. And finally, a statewide recall is the process where citizens can remove elected officials prior to their official term completion. And so now, having gone through some of the different types of direct democracies that we saw as the most important or the most relevant to this research topic, I'm going to pass it on to Eitan, who will explain the nuances of how initiatives intermingles with U.S. democracy on a wider scale.
Okay, so as Wesley just said, there are several different types of direct democracy in the U.S. Of those, California has 6 of them, which makes California the most progressive state, or one of the most progressive states. There are several other states, Montana, Arizona, Oregon, Colorado, that have the similar system where they have 6 of the 7 that exist in America. And when I use the term progressive, I mean it in the historical sense and not necessarily in the current political definition as being on the left. It means more of progressivism as the progressive party of the early 20th century, this idea that citizens need to provide or need to make government accountable for the decisions that they make. There are other states, Texas, Wisconsin, Minnesota, those are notable examples that don't have this system. They essentially only have one form of direct democracy, and that is constitutionally or legislatively referred constitutional amendments. And those are very rare. I mean, you don't see states ever really offering the citizens an opportunity to vote on amendments to the constitution of their state. So it's a fairly rare thing. Basically, those states don't have any direct democracy at all. So what this sets up is essentially a dichotomy. You have these two camps, the progressive and the non-progressive camp. And it's a nonpartisan project. So these states, California, Texas, they fall all over the political spectrum. So this is not really a project about it's not about core beliefs. It's just about an experiment, a democracy experiment, whether or not this fits into the Federalist Republic system that we have in the United States overall. One thing that you can say for sure is that there's no real correlation between direct democracy and voter turnout. States like Texas have pretty poor voter turnout. California, Arizona also has very poor turnout, and they're on the complete opposite sides of the spectrum. Wisconsin, Minnesota have very good voter turnout, and they're the least progressive in terms of democracy. Oregon has very good democracy. Colorado has very good democracy. And what it turns out is that a lot of this just comes down to demographics. Texas has a fairly young population. Most of them, relative to the rest of the United States, there's a lot of people under 30, and age has been shown to be pretty much the most predictable factor in terms of voting turnout. One thing that this also leads to, this dichotomy, is that you have states like California that are very messy in terms of the propositions that they put up. Over here we have vote no on Prop 10, bad for homeowners, worse for tenants, and yes, Affordable Housing Act. The average voter is fairly uninformed. They're going to see signs like this, and they're going to be fairly perplexed as to which side of the aisle they fall on. I mean, we all want more affordable homes, and we don't want to be bad for tenants. So it sort of seems like you're really left with a choiceless choice in some sense. Okay. So there are basically two schools of thought on whether or not this experiment works. The first school of thought I call progressive federalism, and this is the pro camp. The second school I call non-consequentialist. You can also call it a bipartisan camp. These are people who think bipartisanism is just the best thing ever. So in terms of the pro account, progressive federalism, there seems to be a thought that this provides an additional check in the Federalist Republic that we have. The idea is that when legislatures sort of step out of the interests of the citizens have a way of voting to counter that, essentially. Also, another appealing aspect of ballot initiatives is that they're a lot less opaque than the kind of laws that are passed by legislatures. A lot of legislatures, they pass these, there's a lot of back and forth, trading of favors that goes on in the legislature, and eventually the law that comes out is sort of this nothing law of interest groups kind of butting heads and figuring out something that will make everybody happy. And then there's also a kind of a controversial claim in this side of the camp that it has the potential to increase voter awareness or voter education. And I'm going to talk about that in the second camp and why it's a disputable claim. I mean, it seems intuitive that people, if they're given the opportunity to vote on something that matters to them, they're going to be educated on that matter. But there's some dispute to that, and I'll get to that. So the non-consequentialist camp, or the bipartisan camp, thinks that log rolling is good. This trading of favors, we have a Federalist Republic for a reason, and that reason is because we don't want really consequential laws unless they're really popular, unless people really, really have huge, broad support for them. And so this is sort of the Federalist ideal that non-consequentialists think that initiatives kind of sidestep. We don't want this. Another potential drawback is that initiatives are not very well regulated. In California, you need 5% of the state's population. You have 150 days to do that. And essentially what that means is that these big interest groups can hire sales representatives to go around and collect signatures. And ultimately, that doesn't really put the power into people's hands. It puts the power into people who have money's hands. They can go out and collect these signatures, whereas the average citizen can't really mobilize to that extent. So up here I have a graph, and this is the main criticism of the second camp, that that direct initiatives don't increase voter awareness. So there's two sorts of efficacy that you can talk about when you're talking about democracy. You have this internal and this external efficacy distinction. Internal efficacy is trusting that your vote is going to make a difference in the system. And external efficacy is trusting that the system does what it says it's supposed to do. It's essentially trusting democracy and whether or not it works. So you can see on the left here, I have a chart. On the top, you have the sort of a idealized version of what efficacy is. Various polls kind of determine that right around 1996, you have kind of the lowest point in efficacy. People in America virtually didn't trust the government. And at the same time, what it reflects is that there's the highest number of initiatives. So basically, when people don't trust the government, they think they take it into their own hands to put initiatives on the ballot. And that makes sense. If you don't trust, you think that's the whole progressive project is exactly that. Unfortunately, you can also see in 1996, 49% was the voter turnout among voting age population. Basically, when people don't trust the government, they also don't vote. So this is the main criticism of the increases education. People who are already likely to vote, it does increase their education, but it doesn't increase education overall. It doesn't make this distinction between people who are already likely to vote and people who are not likely to vote at all. So I'm going to leave, between the two camps, there's obviously merits on both sides. There's merits to the fact that citizens should have a mechanism to go out and check the government, and there's also merits to the fact that maybe this non-consequentialist point of view is good. Maybe we do need some sort of log rolling that happens. We don't think it's a good idea necessarily to ask an uninformed population to make these very broad consequential decisions. So it seems that there's merits to both sides, and I think a sort of synthesized account is possible. But I want to leave that for the concluding section of this presentation. And with that, I'm going to hand the floor over to James, and he's going to be talking about interest groups, which is very relevant to why people don't trust the government.
Okay, thank you, Eitan. So I'm going to be talking about, as well as Milo, we'll be talking about interest groups, and specifically interest groups and financing, because we find that interest groups can raise a lot of money, and they spend a lot of money, and that has a great effect on ballots. So basically, why do interest groups participate in ballot initiatives? And the main reason basically is that they can spend about as much as they can raise. Interest groups don't have the same regulations that elected official campaigns do, so they can take in a lot more money and they can spend a lot more money. And a lot of that goes towards ads. We find that interest groups participate in 4 different ways in the initiative and legislature roles. They can support an initiative, block it, they can push the legislature to pass something, or to block it. Now we find that different groups act in different ways. Research shows that depending on the makeup of the group, who's coming together, is this a citizen group that has grassroots and they're getting the whole state, energized, or is this a special interest group that has heavy financing from big donors? How it's put together affects on basically how they'll act, how we expect them to act, and their success. Groups also can put pressure on the legislature, and they can do this a lot to compromise. One of the examples we found was there was a soda tax passed, and the soda lobby really didn't like it. So what they did was they got together and passed or put an initiative on the ballot that went farther than just the tax. It did a lot more than just repeal the tax that they didn't like. They added other provisions. And so what that forced the legislature to do is come together with them and say, listen, if you back off this initiative, we will repeal our tax and we will work with you more, other than you just going out and really outflanking us, I guess you could say. Even if these things fail, the ballot initiatives, we find that legislatures might take up this issue anyways. The example we found was there was an HMO reform that went out, and it really wasn't written well, and it didn't pass, it didn't get the required percent, and it failed. And the legislature said, listen, there's a good amount of support for this. It didn't get the required, the percentage need, but there's still some support for this. So we'll take up the issue ourselves and see if we can fix it. And the last one is that groups can put on ballot stuff that legislatures can't touch. There are some issues in politics that if you bring them up, they're really tricky for politicians to navigate and craft a good message. The best example for this is the recent marijuana legislation. It's been really hard for legislators to sort of talk about this issue in a more rational way, and interest groups have a chance to sort of put their own version of it on the ballot, and from there they can change it so that the population will understand it a little more. We also see interest groups acting over acting towards uninformed voters versus legislators. We found that they thought it was easier to deal with voters than legislators, and they also preferred initiatives to referendums because, like Wesley said, referendums come down from the legislature, and they don't have control over that as much as they do an initiative. They don't get to write language for it, and they may not like how it's written, so they usually would prefer to use an initiative. And then how successful are they? Like I said before, we have different types of interest groups and how they are put together. So citizen groups are, your basic grassroots come together for a social issue. We see that they tend to support ballot initiatives that change the status quo because they find these issues important to them. Other than just economic interests, they find issues that impact their community every day. So they'll come together and try and change the status quo. Economic groups, they tend to be more funded with bigger donors. They're financially backed, organized. They'll come to try to keep the status quo, and that's just based on the fact that they usually like to see things out in advance. They like a calm market. They like to see where things are going. So that's why we see them acting a little more towards the status quo. Where each tends to act is that, I already covered that. Economic groups rarely lack the financial resources. So because they have these big donors, it's really easy for them to get out a bunch of ads. And where we see that acting a lot is in propositions that have a lot of mixed messages. Like Eitan brought up with Prop 10, you're not really sure where you stand based on those ads. So in a lot of cases, we see that no will usually win, the no vote, because people don't understand what a yes vote means. So just to be safe, they'll vote no and try not to change the status quo. Changing the status quo requires a lot. It requires broad support, and it does require money. And we see that citizen groups tend to have that. They have the broad public coalitions because if they can get signatures, if they can do all this against financial interests, then there's definitely broad support for this issue. However, you do see citizen groups on both sides because they're citizen groups, and citizens aren't all thinking the same ways. There are Democrats and Republicans, independents. It's all over the place, so you will see them on both sides of the aisle. And I think that's important because we shouldn't mitigate that because it's important to see where these citizen groups are going. And I'll hand it over to Milo, who will finish talking about how successful groups are.
Thank you, James. So James discussed an important distinction between the two types of groups, whether it's citizen groups or economic groups, and the important strengths and weaknesses that they have. And so there's some empirical evidence to back this up. So when we look at the type of group supporting a proposition and how often those propositions are successful in passing, citizen groups are able to pass them at a 60% rate, which is pretty good. But the economic groups have significant trouble doing this, only passing 22% of their initiatives. And this goes back to what James was talking about, with economic groups lacking the broad public support and the high-profile endorsements that are absolutely crucial in order to pass an initiative, whereas citizen groups kind of inherently have that, and the money plays less into it on this side when you're trying to put through an initiative. But on the other side, when economics and citizen groups are trying to oppose ballot initiatives, we see far greater success from both sides. Because as James talked about, when the groups are not trying to change the status quo and they're opposing ballot initiatives, they really only need financial backing. The broad public support is not as important because they can just flood the airwaves. And as James said, voters are more inclined to continue with their path and vote no as long as they're convinced by ads. So what we look at next is when these groups go up against each other. So on the top, you'll see the type of group that is supporting the ballot initiatives, and on the left, the type of group that is opposing them. And what's important to note here is the red boxes here, where you have, in both scenarios, you have an economic group opposing the ballot initiative, but then different types supporting it. And what we see is that when you have an economic interest group going up against an economic interest group, it's just a lot of money in play. There isn't a lot of inherent public support or high-profile endorsements. So what happens is you have a high rate of ballot initiative failure at that 20% mark. Whereas when the only thing you change is the type of group supporting the ballot initiative, and you continue to have an economic group
opposing it, you have a far higher rate of passage of 64% because you do have that broad public support on one side going up against the money. And so what we can take away from this is that it is important to watch out for interest groups, specifically ones backed by a lot of money and specific economic interests, to get involved. That can be an issue for the citizens, but only really in stopping ballot issues that might be helpful to them. There's very little risk of economic groups with large financial backing coming in and actually changing things up in a way that the general public wouldn't necessarily want. So moving on to Proposition 10. Proposition 10 was on the ballot this year. The main portion of the proposition was to repeal the Costa-Hawkins legislation, which would then allow cities throughout California to enact rent control, which they currently cannot. So during the 1970s and 80s, cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Berkeley, Oakland all enacted different types of rent control measures. But in response to this, the California legislature in 1995 passed the Costa-Hawkins legislation, which stopped cities from being able to impose their own rent control measures, and no rent control could be imposed on any new building after 1995. But today, in 2018, California faces a serious housing shortage and housing crisis with increasing rent rates, and so there's been a lot more support for possibly revisiting rent control issues. However, in the legislature, this has not worked. There was a bill in January of this year to repeal Costa-Hawkins, but it never got out of committee because with 4 Democrats on the committee and 3 Republicans, 2 of those Democrats abstained from voting because of the political fallout of potentially getting involved. So it failed and it moved nowhere, forcing housing advocates to take it to the ballot as a proposition. So those supporting Proposition 10 were primarily housing advocates and the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Now, these committees raised about $26 million, which you can see there, but failed to match the amount that the opposing groups raised of $75 million. And on the opposing side, you had other housing advocates because these people were kind of split on the idea because even if they wanted more affordable housing, they weren't sure that rent control was the right way to go about it. This manifested in the fact that we had both candidates for governor, both John Cox and Gavin Newsom, opposing the ballot initiative, with Gavin Newsom saying that he was in favor of more affordable housing but did believe rent control was the way to do it. However, as you can see, $75 million was raised by the opposition committees, and that money came primarily from companies with a lot of real estate in California, which you can see in the table here. On the left side of that table, you have companies based on how much real estate they have in the state, and on the right side is how much they donated to opposition committees. Now, it's not an exact correlation. You do have some companies with a large amount of real estate not contributing, but there is a distinct connection with the money primarily coming from these real estate companies. And there's even an example of Blackstone, a Wall Street company who has a lot of real estate assets here, having a call with investors in which they assured them that the proposition would not be passing in order to maintain their stock price. So when it came down to how the public felt about the proposition, the LA Times did a survey earlier in 2018 in which they asked voters why they believed California housing was unaffordable, and the #1 answer from 28% of respondents was that there was a lack of rent control. Now the #6 most common response was a lack of new building, which is what the people who oppose the ballot proposition believes is the best answer. So there's a big disconnect between what the public believes is the answer to this and what the supporters in opposition believe based on the proposition. However, as of September, based on a Public Policy Institute of California poll, only 36% of people, or 36% of likely voters said they were going to vote for Proposition 10, and that number dropped to 25% in the same poll in October. Now, why this might have happened is a lot of ads coming from the no side confusing voters, as we've talked about, and how the money involved can confuse voters. on the side here, you can see some excerpts from an ad opposing Proposition 10, and here is the same quote highlighted. So the quote that they showed there is the San Diego Union Tribune saying, measure could inadvertently make the existing housing crisis even more extreme. Now, they specifically highlighted the section in yellow in order to cause fear among voters that they needed to say no to Prop 10 in order to maintain their own home values and their own rent amounts. But it very specifically did not highlight the fact that this was not a confident statement that it could inadvertently make the housing crisis work. And just an example of how these ads cause voters to be unsure of the fallout of the proposition and just stick to voting no, as we've talked about. So what happened is you did have voters vote down on the ballot proposition with a margin of 40% saying yes, 60% saying no. In light of this, housing advocates have said that they're going to try to work with Gavin Newsom to increase affordable housing, but if that does not work out, they will put the ballot back, or the ballot proposition back on the ballot in 2020. So on balance, Proposition 10 showed that ballot initiatives were not an effective use of direct democracy, considering that this was an issue the legislature would not touch. But then when it went to the people, they wanted rent control, or at least believed it could be very helpful, but then eventually voted down against it. And so this showed that it was just not an effective way to advance the people's beliefs and what they wanted. And with that, I will pass it back on to James to talk about Proposition 6.
Okay. So, Ambika and myself covered Proposition 6. Now, Proposition 6 came to be after the California State Senate passed Senate Bill 1, the Road Repair and Accountability Act in 2017. Now, what this did was it passed a 12-cent tax on gas and a 20-cent tax on diesel, as well as some other vehicle fees, which were designed to increase the state's transportation budget. Just this past June, Proposition 69 was passed to create a lockbox for that money to go right into the transportation budget. On that same ballot, there was a recall for a state senator, Josh Newman, who actually lost over his support of this. So it is already a contentious issue, which gave us Prop 6. Prop 6 reversed the taxes and additionally added another provision that stated that any future tax would have to be passed by the legislature as well as a vote by the voting populace, like an initiative, a referendum. Now what this did was created some national tension as well as something to drive Republicans to vote. Because this was crafted by a more conservative group, we saw that this provision was set out so that Republicans would come to vote, especially in a year when they were expecting high Democratic turnout. There were two main committees, Yes on 6 and No on 6. Yes on 6 main support was state and national Republicans. Like I said before, some of the national Republicans we saw were Paul Ryan and Steve Scalise, as well as state Republicans running for governor, John Cox, and Representative Kevin McCarthy. All of them donated to the Yes on 6, and we're all in favor of it. No on 6 was the main opposition group, and we see that, of course, Democrats did contribute to this, but their main donor was construction firms, things like the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers and the AFL-CIO. Now, we see those because they would benefit the most from those taxes staying in place. The money was set to go towards repairing roads, repairing bridges. Some of it was going to go towards the BART system in the Bay Area, some of it in the metro system down here. So it was going to improve transportation, and they would benefit if those projects that they had all planned continued and followed through and were built. One of the more interesting things I think about this is the way each group sort of, not attacked the issue, but branded it. So you can see Yes on 6, they say, Yes on 6, repeal the gas tax. They were clearly trying to get their base to come out because this was a tax, and a lot of their base is anti-tax. No on 6 branded it as stop the attack on bridge and road safety. They're making the case that, listen, this money is going right into the transportation budget, it's going to make our roads safer, and we think that even though there is a tax and gas in California is expensive, we think we should keep this money in here and repair our roads. And then to go to the money they've raised. Proposition 6 and support committees, which is Yes on 6 and a few other smaller ones, raised only about $4.8 million, and then they spent $4.2. Now what's really interesting about this one is the proposition support committees actually paid money to get these signatures. They paid us a consulting group that went out and got the signatures. So 2 million of that 4.2 was spent on getting signatures. So they really couldn't and they didn't spend as much money as the opposition committees, which raised 46 million and spent 35 on ads. Because they raised more money, I mean, it's very clear that this was going to lose, as Ambika will say. But they raised more money, and definitely we would have expected to see a no loss in this one. And I'll pass it on to Ambika now.
Thank you. Now I'd like to talk about some of the predictions we had for Prop 6. One of the reasons we thought that Prop 6 might fail was something that we call the no effect, where, as we discussed earlier, it is easier for economic groups to win when they are opposing a proposition, because money doesn't necessarily put as much influence in a supporting group campaign. Therefore, since the No on Proposition campaign group had more money, we anticipated that there was a possibility that Prop 6 would have lost. On the other hand would be what we call the tax effect, where the public usually votes to keep taxes low. So if we consider this, then we would have anticipated that Prop 6 would have won. In the end, public opinion polls tended to lean on no on Prop 6. In the polls that use the same text as the legislation, saying that the prop would eliminate certain road repair and transportation funding, voters tended to lean no on Prop 6. And you can see that in the category highlighted on the right. In Survey USA polls that said Prop 6 would repeal gasoline and diesel taxes, explicitly said that Prop 6 would repeal taxes. As you can see in these left two columns, the public generally leaned on yes on Prop 6. So the difference in public opinion in this case had to do with the legislation's wording. If the legislation's wording was more clear that Prop 6 repealed the gas taxes, Proposition 6 may have passed. In the end, Prop 6 did fail to pass. In this case, we can confirm that the no effect was upheld, the opposition had more money, and we can't really consider the tax effect because voters were not sure that the proposition repealed the tax. Now I'm going to talk about a few policy recommendations, and after me, Eitan will conclude with a few remarks. I want to first start with the pros and cons of the initiative system. On the con side, first, initiatives are rather inflexible. As Wesley said, it's very hard to repeal or amend propositions that are passed into law. In some cases, legislatures can't even amend or repeal without voter input. Next, there is a large lack of transparency in the initiative process. Ads use fear to sway voters. The official voter guide itself isn't fact-checked. The official prop language remains unclear to voters, as seen in the Proposition 6 public opinion polls. The lack of transparency is further seen in that it's very difficult to find out how much money was given by whom to prop committees. The Secretary of State's website will give you a headache trying to find out where all the money is coming from, where it's going. The process is confusing to top it off. The people aren't aware of what they can do in the voting process. Can they register the same day? Can they bring materials with them to polls? People aren't really sure, and this confusion contributes to the issues in the lack of transparency in the initiative system. If that wasn't bad enough, voters often experience something that we call voter fatigue. When a high number of propositions make their way to the ballot, voters struggle to research and make informed decisions. Some may argue, well, at least initiatives increase voter turnout, but this is not entirely true. As we saw earlier, there isn't enough data to completely support this claim. And so ballot initiatives aren't very responsible for increasing voter turnout. The pros of the initiative system lies in the fact that it is connected to direct democracy. Initiatives allow for policy changes that politicians would not necessarily want to act on or that would not pass through a particular partisan legislature. Initiatives put power back in the hands of the people, checking elitism, and providing a more transparent system than the shadowy deals and log rolling of politicians. Now here's a list of policy recommendations that I have for you, arranged from the more feasible options to maybe the less feasible. First would be cleaning up Alex Padilla's Secretary of State website so that there's more transparency in the money usage. Next, the government needs to have fact-check voter guides and bias-check proposition text. Misinforming voters is unacceptable. Next, the media needs to hold groups that are fear-mongering accountable, and voters themselves need to seek out trustworthy information to make sure that they are voting on the right things with the right information. To make the process less confusing, there needs to be more explanation about what voters can or cannot do, when they can vote, when the last day to register to vote is, and whether they can bring materials with them to the polls. Limiting the number of initiatives on the ballot would greatly reduce voter fatigue. This could be done by increasing the public opinion trust of the government. And lastly, introducing a constitutional amendment to allow legislatures to amend or repeal propositions would help solve the inflexibility of the process. Now I want to hand it back to Eitan with a few concluding remarks.
Okay, thank you. So earlier I alluded to a synthesized account that I think is possible for the two camps that I presented, the non-consequentialist bipartisan camp and the progressive federalist camp. Both are federalists, just to be clear. One just thinks that the current system that we have is sufficient. The other thinks that we need this additional check. So some of these, the synthesized account essentially means that both sides have merit. I said that earlier. I think that one possible way of sort of keeping the merits of both sides is to introduce indirect initiatives and legislatively referred initiatives more often. We have legislatively referred initiatives in California. They're less likely to appear on ballots. Basically, we have the legislature come up, draft a bill, do a little fighting over the merits of each side, and then present it to the voters and have them decide whether the overall merits of that thing, whether it's worth it or not. The indirect initiatives is something that we don't have in California. A few other states have it. Essentially, that means that, I know Nevada, for example, has it. We have citizens mobilize, draft a bill, and then present it to the legislature, and then have them vote on it. Let them sort of make any amendments that they think are necessary to reduce the potential consequences of something that maybe wasn't thought out by people who aren't paid to think through their problems. They just have their self-interest in mind when they draft these things. So that's what I mean when I say you allow some degree of log rolling and to put the onus on legislatures. Have those people who are paid to think about the merits of these bills, have those people argue over it instead of putting it on people who maybe shouldn't be accountable for the consequences that they sow. Factions are unavoidable. There's a James Madison quote that I like to use all the time, and that is, "Liberty is to factions what air is to fire." We have something in liberties, especially freedom of speech, freedom of the vote, that are afforded to people, always divides the country. We're going to always be divided in this way. We're always going to have interest groups kind of tussling for their moment. And this is just a natural thing. You can't do anything about it. So in terms of policy recommendations, I think it behooves the citizens to have this indirect democracy and to have to maybe reform the system of gathering signatures. I think that having it tilted so far towards interest groups who have money, who are going to use their money to pay sales representatives and essentially just buy the entire marketplace for themselves, that's sort of it's a ridiculous thing. You can't have that. I think frankly, you need to expand the amount of time. You need to make the system a lot more streamlined and a lot more available to citizens who actually feel misrepresented or underrepresented by their legislature. And with that, I want to thank you guys, wish you a hearty fight on, and open the floor to questions. I think we're going to have a seat.
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
good sit. Good job. Very good. Have a seat, guys.
Can I get some coffee?
Yes.
Yeah, go get coffee and cookies and
Grab a
stuff too.
cookie. You guys did a great job.
It's clean up
Put a lot of work in there. Yeah.
It's a lot different than 8 a.m.
Yeah, right? The energy was pretty high yesterday at 8 a.m. though. I was pretty proud.
Oh, when you get your Red Bull, that's gonna happen.
Oh, yeah.
This is a good job of incorporating feedback. I know it's unfortunately we had the day before. But
Timing was hard this semester.
I got that. Got that at 7 a.m. on the freeway.
Yeah, I mean, that's
Someone sit
just
next
the last, 3 weeks we're meeting with
Yeah.
every week.
Yeah.
We have been with them, just because of Thanksgiving, it took us out of our cycle.
All right.
Well,
We're done.
Yeah, I just thought,
Yeah.
I was on your last slide. I thought of that anytime.
I was
thinking about it the whole time.
I hope it was fun.
we were London.
I'm disappointed. I didn't realize that the color I selected for the back was different from the. I tried to find it on the computer screen, but then. It's fine.
Yeah, we have a family out there, so we did a
The
big,
camera just
we
caught
got a
me.
big table.
Put the cookie
and
to my mouth and
dinner
just spit it out when I
for us. It was so much fun. It is great. Just sitting there. It's
Professional things that they will keep in.
I didn't understand how boss like talked to your wedding because it's gonna be super cold. I'm like,
Behind the scenes.
here,
Yeah.
it's freezing.
I looked at that, but I took the
But it was awesome. It
Oh,
was just
okay.
nice spending time with her. No, yeah, it was a ball. We had family there, so they joined
She
in.
said she got really sad afterwards because she was like, it felt like the last day and then I had to go back.
I slipped in the fight on.
All right,
That was
so,
great.
yeah, this is just an opportunity, and I think it's actually nicer when we can just sort of have
Yeah.
a sort of round table and an opportunity just to talk about the concepts and what worked with the research and what didn't work and what else can be done, and we'll start with you, Leslie.
Well, first, I loved it. I thought it was so great. I was really fascinated by this notion that once the proposition passes, it's very hard to repeal it. I'm curious why it wouldn't be just as easy to pass another proposition to repeal it. Why is that such a sticking point? What did you find out? Because everybody complains about Prop 13,
Right.
but a lot of people love it.
People who get the advantage.
Yeah,
of it.
people get
Right,
the
yeah.
advantage of it. So there's a whole dichotomy there. But you often think, well, then I'm so surprised it's been around for so long. How come somebody hasn't tried to undo Prop 30? Did you find in any of your research what that stumbling block was to get rid, to getting rid of bad propositions that survive the courts? Right. That was one other piece too, is how often they end up in court. I don't know if you found that too, but did you come up with any reason, or did people just kind of out of gas, or they just figure it's fixed? Because obviously the legislature cannot, right? They cannot repeal the proposition. So is there just not enough voter support to go back and tackle these issues, or do you think it's just, I'm just curious as to why you think that there's no way, because it shows you then they're very dangerous if bad ones pass.
Yeah.
That's also one of the downsides of it, right? If you get this proposition that ends up with all this dark money and they really, seductive ads, and it really ends up passing, you're really stuck. So I'd be curious if you ran across any papers or conversations or anything about why more people don't try to get rid of
So
bad
in the-
propositions.
Probably near the beginning of my research, I kind of stumbled upon just a little blurb saying that it's the entire process, or at least for California, is very it's unreliable but also very costly. I don't remember the specifics about, I just know it's a very convoluted process because it requires voters and just the proponents of law, like a new law, to have a lot of financial backing to try to to fix something that's already been passed.
Right. I
think.
wonder too if it isn't, you run the risk too of it being thrown into court. It has to be so perfectly done in order to wipe out the existing proposition that even if you get it passed, you would probably face some serious court challenges.
It must be something like
there
that,
must
because
be
we don't
something
see,
because
we never see that,
It's harder
right?
than doing something
Right,
new
we
because there's
never-
grandfathered in
Right.
groups or.
Because we never see anybody trying to repeal. And I use
Short
Prop
of the
13,
initial,
but-
yeah, short of the sort of court challenge, right?
Right,
We see
that's
plenty of
where it
that.
ends up,
That's about
right?
it.
Yeah, people try to take it to court to get rid of it. So I found that really interesting. I don't think I really appreciated that before I saw this presentation, which goes to your point about how dangerous they can be, but at the same time, you have sometimes ineffective legislatures. I'm also interested about this notion about citizens going and doing their own initiative and then presenting it to the legislature that you had suggested. Has that been successful in states? I mean, I guess I'm such a skeptic. I figure, oh yeah, sure, thanks for that
So,
nice
I
initiative.
think it
You can go home
depends.
now.
Yeah.
I think it depends on definition of successful, because it's like you have this successful in democracy. What does that mean? Does that mean that more likely to pass the right rule, or does that mean more likely to get voters to turn out?
Right.
So in the states that have indirect initiatives, I think that for the most part, voter turnout has to do with demographics voting culture. You know, you have states like Montana, people are dispersed. I don't know, I think there's a lot more like a social cohesion in states like that. When people are dispersed, they maybe, there's probably some sociological phenomenon why people in Colorado, Oregon, and Montana have really high voter turnout. So, and some of those states, I know Nevada has this, and that's a state that's essentially jammed into like 2 cities.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think it depends on your understanding. I think, is it successful in terms of does it get the right policy? I would think yes.
Do you think it satisfies voters? I mean, for me, I looked at it as like, that's a place where good bills go to die. You know, you worry that, because I understand the point of it, because it said, okay, don't have to raise all this money, you don't have to put it on the ballot, but you can get enough people to present some decent initiative and then float it to the legislature and hold them accountable. I guess that there's an accountability piece of it, where they can't just brush it off.
Right. I mean, I think that direct initiatives accomplish the same thing, but it puts less pressure on legislatures to do something about it if the citizens have the capability. Because if the citizens have the capability, now it's their responsibility essentially. If this is something that's like that the interest groups who are lobbying the legislatures, they don't want it to happen, now the legislatures are probably never going to make it happen.
Right.
But where the other thing happens, where you have people going directly to the legislature, and it's a more direct demand, like, hey, we need you to vote on this now. We don't care what the interest groups have to say. This is our interest. We are the interest group. I think it's essentially it's like citizen lobbying.
Yeah, no, it's good. I mean, it may be a very effective way to do it, and it takes a lot of the onus of this ads and you know, getting it on the ballot and all of that. It's a really interesting concept. I don't think I had really appreciated either, because we don't have it. You know, and you don't hear that much about it.
The entire thing is an experiment, right?
Well, this whole country's
The
an
whole-
experiment.
Yeah. So
We're still in the
Your
process,
experiment,
right?
yeah.
We're one
yeah,
giant
the
lab.
whole thing is an experiment, whether or not this, and it works in some places, it doesn't work in other places. I think that having interest groups appeal directly to the people is really confusing for people.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can see that.
So there needs to be a mechanism for citizens to essentially be their own interest group, I think, instead of having, you know, these.
So is that like a citizen advocate, nonpartisan
It's like
commission,
ombuds or
something
ombudsman
like
or
that,
something,
right? Because there's
right.
got to be something. Because
I'm not familiar with the details. Like I don't know if it's like a signature, how the signature gathering works for something like that. But I would imagine.
That's something I'd vote for that proposition.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept and a way to have more accountability and also get the big dough out.
The one thing I found kind of puzzling is that states that have direct democracy never have indirect. Who have direct initiatives never have indirect initiatives.
They don't coexist.
I don't understand why they don't coexist. It seems to me that you can have both of them. It doesn't seem like they.
Two paths to right.
I just had a question. I'm really interested in this idea of ballot initiatives increasing voter turnout. And so you said that like the data's just not there, right?
Yeah.
But there is some correlation between, I mean, like the states that do have direct democracy do not have high voter turnout. But have there been any studies that you found that were done that controlled for age and demographics and some of these other things that actually did look at, does direct democracy increase turnout, or is there just, the data's just not there?
I read a couple things about how age is basically the #1 indicator of the likelihood of voter turnout. Texas is a very young state, and they have their like 44, 45 usually. That's where they come, but they've been trending as their population has aged relative to the country. They've been trending upward. So that's like.
But that's voting in general, not.
Yeah.
Right,
so
but
we're-
is there any study that looks at like, okay, so of all the people who are, you know, like 65 and older, are more of them voting in a place where there's direct democracy? Are they more, you know, eager to get out of their armchair and get down to the polls? Vote by mail-in?
Oftentimes, too, don't you think it's probably there's a hot proposition?
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Well, and I think about some of the like housing and like tax-related propositions that really have a lot to do with, you know, older folks. Like I feel like that would increase voter turnout, but maybe among certain population.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see a study that
Yeah,
focused
that
on propositions that
controlled for
specifically affected
Certain
High voter
Medicare.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
something
right,
that's really
right.
targeted like that. I bet you.
dialysis community that's
Yeah.
fascinating.
And even if it doesn't,
Well-
you could wrap it up in this package so you get it
Right,
right? I mean, that's
right.
a whole other way to game it.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, I was shocked to see the Irvine company the biggest
really
with
shocked.
$0.
Yeah,
That was.
so-
Can you explain that?
So there is a little footnote on there. Their participation is a little more convoluted. It may, essentially, my understanding is it may be that they, in an indirect way, had maybe some of the more principal owners of the
Like
company.
Donald Brent just wrote a check
Yeah.
for his name.
Yeah, so I'd say take that one piece of that table
Yeah.
with a grain of
Okay,
salt.
okay.
That was
Because
pretty.
it just flew off the chart. You know,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
caught my attention for
But
sure.
besides that one, so if you take that company out of it, there was a fairly consistent correlation.
Yeah.
And specifically, I mentioned Blackstone before.
Yeah.
They aren't inherently a real estate company, but because of the 2008 financial crisis, they started heavily investing in these depreciated assets in the California housing market. And so now that has become a large portion of their assets. And so they were extremely invested in this. They were not in that table because they aren't a real estate company. But I think their donations, both strict donations and in-kind services, was nearly $10 million. So, and
Voters would not like that if they knew.
yeah,
Yeah.
really
there
would
was
not go
some
over
media
well.
coverage of their involvement,
Was there?
but not as much as I would have thought,
That
considering
is really Darth
considering
Vader
it.
coming to town.
And when I read the thing about their investor call and ensuring their investors that they would fail, it was a little disturbing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's the tough part.
I'm curious on Prop 10, and this is just for my personal information, but if the governor-elect was against Prop 10, what is his alternative to housing?
We'll find out.
Yeah.
Or like, what did he say at least?
He didn't have, I think that he very specifically was not very explicit in it. It was very
Got it.
difficult to find, for example, I first came across the fact that he was against it as kind of an anecdote in some article. And so when I went searching for
Yeah, I'm pretty
where he
surprised.
said this, I found one smaller talk he gave where he was very vague about it. But what it boils down to, I think, is him and the other housing advocates who are against it is they just think we need more building, which is true.
Which technically correlates to what he did in San Francisco, but I'm fairly positive those units were all rent
Yeah,
controlled.
it just surprises me that, for the mayor, right? He's mayor.
He was
Yeah.
mayor in the.
Isn't that the capital of rent
Yes.
control?
Yeah.
Where did
he-
you get Santa Monica?
There's like
Right.
a.
Yeah, I'm from San Francisco, and I don't know. There's not really any more space,
It's
but
like-
it's the more
Yeah.
rural areas of California where you need the more building. I guess then the process there is you build more further from the cities, and then you have gentrification happening. You still have raising rents in the cities, but at least then there's somewhere for people to go. I don't know that that's my personal preference of how it should play out, but
Right, because that just means you're gonna drive farther to get to work,
In
Yeah.
the last
which is our other presentation.
5 years, in the last 6 years, I worked at the city of Oakland 6 years ago. The African American population was 75% and is now 25, which is insane.
Yeah.
And people are still working where they're working.
Yeah.
So the jobs stay the same, but
yeah,
I don't know where they're going.
the thing that I felt like there wasn't enough specific research on that I would have really liked to have is all these economists say, okay, well, rent control is just going to make it less likely that you have people building housing because there's less profit to be made there, and so it drives down the prices of homes and stuff like that. But that's just, they talk about it in theory. There isn't a lot of research specifically showing examples of that. And there was a study done by a group here at USC
Yeah.
that tried to counter that idea and say that it
Right.
actually could be better for homeowners and builders. But their evidence was all literature-based. There was no statistical evidence, so it's very
Yeah.
tough to use that. But that would be really important to have moving forward because it hasn't been proven recently.
The only argument I'll make is Sadia's district that was building all those affordable housing units over here in like downtown Silver Lake-ish area, and had the investors all in, ready to go. And I think it was a combination of like affordable housing plus market price. And once the investors figured out, oh crap, these areas are actually like gentrifying and it's going to be really great and we can make more of a profit, they completely backed away from their initial proposal, and they weren't locked into anything anyway. So the whole like split housing argument, I don't know how it works with, because you have to have the people that are like investing in the property first and foremost. This is like what my whole graduate program's about, is like, how do you get the money but then do social good but then still make a profit?
Yeah, I think the last thing I'll say about Prop 10 is, at the end of the day, I personally think it really should have passed because it doesn't add rent control, it just allows cities to impose it.
Well,
Yeah.
that
That
goes
was
back
the
to the
thing.
misinformation.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
so, but
Right.
Not one ad said what it did.
I know, right, I know.
Not one ad, not even the pro people.
Yeah.
Why would the pro people stand up and say, all this is doing is giving cities the opportunity? That's all it's doing.
Well, and on the ballot,
It's not
didn't
that
it
they-
say like it repealed whatever act it was, and so you're kind of like, if you're not an educated voter,
Right, you
you're
have
like,
no idea. You'd be like, what's
Well,
the,
yeah, right.
what's that?
yeah, I think that,
Surprised by how many newspaper endorsements were opposed to it. We're going down Prop
Oh,
10
yeah.
rabbit hole, but I think the LA Times was the only newspaper, California, the only major newspaper in California that actually endorsed Prop 10.
could it be because of real estate for them?
real estate,
Yeah.
this is the
This is
advertisers.
The
the
diet.
city where they need it, yeah.
Yeah.
But,
And
yeah, no, everybody else.
And I used the restroom, but I think I caught into the question that I was gonna ask, but that if we did remove or if we put in place a law about ballot signatures, that's what you guys talked about? What would happen? Or am I?
Well,
No.
there was just a issue about the fact that it's kind of a bogus system because you just pay people.
Oh, so that's what I'm wondering, is so if there was a law that put in place to stop the ability to pay people for
There are
signatures.
people who have been trying
Yeah.
to do
What-
that.
it's been deemed
But
unconstitutional.
But what would be, so that's what I'm saying, like, what is the alternative to that in order to get propositions on the ballot?
Right, and the
They
one
just
thing
need
I
more
heard
time.
was, at
Yeah,
least I
right.
thought I heard,
Yeah.
increase the amount of signatures required to try to limit the number of ballots. Did someone?
Or give more time, is that what it was?
Well, give more time, I think. 150 days is you draft it and then you submit it to the Attorney General, and then a lot of the times, depending on their political affiliation, they might reword it. Like we talked about Prop 6, they want to call it repeal gas tax. It might have been a way more popular thing, but they said, what do they call it? Remove funds for public roads. Yeah, for the transportation budget.
Oh,
So
because Becerra is progressive, is that what you're saying, correlation wise?
Well, no, because
the Attorney General.
Yeah, you have to go through the Attorney General once you propose a specific initiative or like, you have to go through the AG's office, and then he'll have an official title and summary about what the specific proposition
that
or
put
initiative
together?
is about. And so if you have an AG who leans a specific way or wants,
And they all do, by the way.
and they all do,
Yeah,
and they all have their own agendas. They're going to word it in such a way, like where Eitan was saying, how they completely just switched the wording of it, so that a lot of people, even at the ballot like the polling place, they were confused because it just doesn't really make any sense. Like, okay, well, you're not really repealing a gas tax. It's the funds going towards like highway or.
Yeah,
Mm.
so the AG's office is
Infrastructure.
stopgap, hence why the split California thing was like, we're stopping you, and
Yeah.
it needs further, is that what you're saying?
And wasn't it partly you couldn't raise the tax again? You couldn't raise taxes on gas.
That was the other part of it.
Without a vote.
Without a
Yeah.
vote,
Without
yeah,
vote.
right.
They needed to pass the legislature,
Right.
which is a tax, already requires 2/3. And because of that recall, the Democrats actually lost their 2/3 majority in the California State Senate. So they'd have to go through a 2/3 through both, get governor's signature, and then you'd need a referendum, and they'd have to pass it.
Which again
James,
makes
did you find in any of your, and I don't mean to jump in.
No, you're good.
That there was any desire for public funding of these? You know, I'm kind of interested in this whole public funding, not, coming from a Republican, I know you find that shocking, but I get so down and discouraged with the dark money. And, I think about that checkoff box on our taxes, which is, you can contribute to the presidential, fund, but no candidates take it. So that fund now is massively huge, and it's just sitting there, and there's nothing to do with it. So I just wondered if, in looking at some of your research, if any of you found that there was a move on to try to publicly finance these, and eliminate, like if you get enough signatures, you get X amount of dollars to put your initiative forward.
Sounds very European.
Yeah, it does, and it really, I'm sure it's probably not constitutional, but it just feels like there's got to be some other way to get around the awful Secretary of State's website, which is a hall of mirrors, as you said, and I mean, it's just shocking there's no inclination to change it and make it more user-friendly, and then these fraudulent voter guides. I mean, those are, California pretends like we really don't have dark money, but you have to work so hard to get to find out. So anyway, I throw those out as a few.
I don't know if I found anywhere where they talked about putting public money towards it. I would estimate that, we talk about economic and citizen groups. I would estimate the economic groups really wouldn't care. They have enough money already where they can say whatever they want.
Citizen groups.
Citizen groups, I think they would probably be more receptive to it because it gives them a chance to compete if they're going up against an economic interest. If they had some more money, some more public support, where I don't know, they get some time on public television.
Right, equally matched.
Yeah,
somehow.
something like that. I feel like that would play over well. I think it would just be another breakdown, because then you'd have citizen groups on the left and citizen groups on the right, and how do you manage who gets that money? And then going through somewhere like California, where it's or any state that's a trifecta, that comes from all one party, I think you'd run into some problems.
Well, and to be honest, I mean, just knowing the way the Supreme Court operates, it's not gonna get passed properly with FOIA anyway, right? You're gonna say it's a First Amendment right to spend as much as you want.
Right. You can find people to spend it.
Right. Even though it's a little weird, right? Because they're citizen groups, but they're representing support for a proposition, but they're still groups at the end of the day. So I think that's the way they probably look at it.
I think there's the issue of, money is always going to be there. People with money are always going to have the advantage no matter what. The initiative system does give a voice to people who maybe aren't big economic groups. So you do have to take some of the good with the bad, I guess. Yeah.
And tell me about when you looked at the voter guides.
Right.
And do they just take point blank and just slap it in there and nobody really fact checks it? It's just, and are people really, and when you said materials into the voting booth, that was interesting to me that people think they can't bring their voter guide in, or, I mean, I was bring my.
We used to not be able to, bring your phone or anything in.
And it's different with different jurisdictions.
Yes.
But you can, of course, bring your sample ballot in and those kinds of things, but people are unclear about that.
It's a very unclear process. People don't really know. I know in terms of the voter guide, my dad knows I'm the political person in the house. He was like, you analyze this and you tell me how to vote.
Yeah.
So I went through the voter guide. It's like literally at the bottom it says these are not fact checked by anybody, and the submissions for the arguments are done by anybody. They just submit it. There were 2 of the proposition arguments done by some random guy who wasn't even talking about the propositions. He kept talking about some proposition from a long time ago. One of them, I think it was the kidney dialysis one, didn't have a counter argument submission at all. So
Interesting. Gosh, you can't. It's hard to believe the Secretary of State's office has not figured
There's
out.
so many loopholes. It's terrible.
Well, it's just shoddy work for
Well,
the
here's
voters.
the other thing that bugs me. I think it's fascinating are the bond measures. Like people it's like they feel like it's Christmas Day. Well, I'll just give away money here. Do they have any understanding that eventually those bonds are going to cost the state huge? And it's every single election cycle we get more and more bonds passed.
Yeah.
Well, these things,
They think it's free money.
they think it's free money.
I know.
But
It's
by
not.
the time, it's like, research I've shown, is as you get older and older, when you're younger, you're like, sure, whatever, but as you keep paying them and you're paying your taxes and you're a homeowner, you're like, nope, you don't even look at what the bond's for anymore.
Yeah.
Because you're just like, I don't even wanna do it.
But you do, at least I would think that somebody should be saying, look, over the last 20 years, look at what this is costing the state in real dollars.
I feel like that would be a really interesting spot for some public money or public, to go. Because I think a lot of people don't understand. Like what you're saying, people don't understand what it's going to cost.
It's a new dog park. Everyone wants a new dog park. Who doesn't like
right.
puppy dogs,
No.
right? But, eventually,
I
this
think
dog park's gonna cost real money.
And so many school districts grow bonds to pay for their schools. There's
Right.
supplemental
Yeah.
bonds to pay for
Well,
their
schools
school
or,
bonds.
you go through them, and it's not like there's 1 or 2 of those bond measures. There's usually like 6 or 7
Right.
every single time.
And the problem with those is that the people that would oppose them, just on the merits of, I don't want to pay more and no one else is going to want to pay more, they're not going to then pay more to oppose it.
Right.
So you really, most of those bond measures this year were completely unopposed money-wise.
Right.
And so,
But no one sits there and says, what's the impact?
Yeah.
Like, it's voters being completely uneducated. Yeah, well, we'll just do that. It's like voting for the judges. Oh, yeah, I like the name.
Bob has a rule though about that unless, because he doesn't think that citizens should be allowed to vote for judges.
Because they don't know anything.
Exactly.
They don't.
So he goes I vote yes on every single person unless for some reason it has come to my attention that someone was wildly corrupt.
Right.
But other way, there is no reason for me.
And even then, it
it's
doesn't
not my
matter. I was telling a story in
responsibility.
class. I mean, there's a judge who, years ago in the 90s that well, it's the story I was telling in class. I don't want to go into it, but basically, my African-American young girl went into a Korean liquor store. She shoplifted like a Twinkie, and the Korean store wife as she was running out, grabbed a gun and killed her. And Janice Carlin. And then she gave Janice Carlin was the judge, and she gave the store owner probation for literally murdering someone.
Yeah.
And there was a huge uproar by the African American community, and her election came up. Someone from my office ran against her. She won like 85% of the vote.
Really?
Yeah. Now, if you can't kick her out for doing that, you're not kicking anybody.
Yeah.
Wow.
They did recall that judge that presided over the Stanford rape case.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's
He
true.
got recalled.
I mean, but it's got to be something that
Major.
and
Yeah.
and that's up in the Bay Area, right? And it's not
Wait,
here.
the
I have a
one
friend
in
who's really
Stanford?
good on the judges,
Yeah,
and she
the Brock
knows the
Turner.
polls, but if I didn't have her,
It's
if I didn't, I mean,
My
she's,
aunt
I
used
love
to
her
call
because she
me-
really researches every judge, and she's, in all these legal groups, and so she really combs through it, but it
There's
takes her forever.
zero business in doing that.
Oh, no, she does it just because she's a good.
Well, no,
citizen.
I know. But
But
there's
every friend
really,
of mine
there-
calls and says, where's that judge list? Because nobody knows.
it's just like,
And these
aren't we
are-
all feeling democratic now? Well, we're guessing,
Oh, yeah, no.
right? Especially when you've got an open judicial race, and who wins? The person that can put gang prosecutor, the biggest.
Yeah, that's always the big one.
That's the
right?
big one. Crazy.
I have one other question for you all on the Constitution, like these states that just have, their only process really is a constitutional amendment, which are zero, like it rarely happens.
Very rare.
And I guess, I'm just curious, did any states have a ballot initiative process that they then eliminated? Or is it always just added? Like California, I don't know when we started doing them and why and what the genesis was, but I would think there would be some states that would want to pass them who are frustrated. And I'm just sort of interested if you ran across sort of the genesis of how states come to have them or not have them.
Yeah. I mean, they were passed by referendums initially. I know that Texas and Wisconsin and Minnesota, those are the three that I pointed out.
Mhm.
They've all had votes on whether or not to have this. And it's a constitutional amendment to put a ballot initiative in the
Okay.
Constitution, so they require a 2/3 majority in order to have this. So
Must
the
be hard.
majority of these initiatives all happened around the same time in like a 15-year span between like 1898 and 1915 or something.
Kind of a wave. of-
Yeah, during Roosevelt's time in office, a lot of that happened. Just in terms of like, it was kind of a populist progressive wave.
Mhm.
And since then, very little nothing much has changed. I think in terms of the initiative system in California, there might have been a couple little tweaks here and there, but it's been more or less the same since 1911.
That's interesting, that is. And it isn't, it's certainly not a growing trend. It's sort of, you have what you have and that's it.
Yeah, I think all of these are, I don't think any of these are statutes that can just be repealed. They're all constitutional
Yeah.
amendments.
And they're mostly western states, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of,
Yeah.
like, west of the Mississippi, most
Have
of them
they?
have them, but then you go back east, and it was not very popular.
Not very.
Kind of tell, it's kind of goes with the cowboy.
Well,
On the
you-
whole, do you think it's a good, I mean, would, if you had to, okay, let's percentage, like it's a 70% good thing, 30% bad. If you had to sort of just give a percentage on how effective you think it is, would you rather be in a, okay, here's a question. Would you rather be in a state that has it or not?
Yeah.
Yes, I would.
Yes.
Really?
That's a good question.
I would just, personally, it's good, but I think there needs to be regulation of it.
It's
Yeah.
inherently
I agree.
flawed.
Just does.
I
It's
mean,
flawed.
it's very underutilized and it's missing a lot of its potential. in
Yeah,
a lot of
exactly.
ways.
And I think USC poli-sci students need to mount a campaign on the Secretaries of State's office.
Yes, oh
Really,
my
no
God.
kidding.
It's
And
so bad.
demand a website that is actually usable and a voter guide that has some kind of backstop.
I have a-
I mean, that is a simple
Yeah.
request
Yeah.
from an average Joe voter. I mean, that should be standard operating.
Yeah,
It
I
is
completely
just
agree.
shocking.
I have a professor in the business school who uses it all the time for like law. He's a lawyer as well, so the
Mhm.
document he downloads all the time. And he told us, he was showing us some. He's like, it changes every 3 months. I don't understand where everything goes.
No,
So
it's
he hates it as well.
nuts, yeah, it's crazy, but again, oh well.
Oh, well.
That's the thing.
And
we
then it
become
goes
just
away.
The land of
And then
We all
inertia.
forget about it.
We all forget
for-
about it, and then the next election comes up, and we're like up in arms for
Yeah,
2 months when the ads start.
no, we go back to.
And we go back and forget it. We're just happy the ads stop.
That's right, 'cause Thanksgiving's looming and gotta go.
That's right. Hey, Black Friday. Right? The important stuff. Well, Leslie, thank you again for
Oh,
working with
it
the
was
team.
fantastic. I learned a lot, so I really appreciate it. I think you guys did just first-rate work. You really did. Really, I hope all of you felt like you learned a lot. I don't think you'll probably ever look at a ballot initiative before you say. And I guess next challenge are the judges.
All right.
Well done, everybody.
Thank you.
Really,
Yeah,
really
good job.
good.